Hello, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning. My name is Luke Bader. I'm the Director of Membership and Programs at the FAIR Institute, and welcome to our webinar today. We are very pleased to have our webinar today brought to us by our sponsor, Protiviti. They are an Institute sponsor, and we partner with them on a quarterly basis to bring different webinars and different content to our members. And today, I'm very excited to hear about this presentation. It's a really interesting topic and very relevant today on NIST Ir 8286. And we have two experts here that are going to be presenting the webinar for you. We have Rebecca Nilsson and we have George Quinlan. Before I turn it over to Rebecca to get started, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping items and say that this session is being recorded, and we will send out a copy of the recording as well as the slide deck in addition to everybody following the call. And then it will be posted in FAIR Institute link in the Resource Library Center probably tomorrow, or at the end, maybe at the end of the day, but probably tomorrow. So you will have access to this afterwards as a FAIR Institute member. Throughout the presentation, we're going to do a couple polls on your screen. Rebecca and George are going to highlight that when you should participate. We are also going to do some Q&A at the end, but throughout the presentation, if you have questions on certain slides, feel free to just throw it into the Q&A chat box there, and we will get to as many as we can at the end. We have an hour scheduled for this webinar, so that'll end at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And again, like I said, but all the questions and all the content will be available for recording following the call. So with that, I think I'm just going to turn it over to Rebecca to get us started.
Great. So can you see the next slide?
Yes.
I know there's a little bit of delay. My name is Rebecca Nilsson. I am a director with Protiviti. I am part of their IAFA practice, and I'm also part of the healthcare solution. Prior to joining Protiviti, I spent 20 years of my career in industry, primarily as an internal audit lead. And in that, internal audit usually does a lot of work with ERM, and so I've had my hands in implementing, re-envisioning, and facilitating ERM programs through healthcare organizations. So that's a little bit of background about me, and I will turn it over to George.
Rebecca, thank you so much, and I'd just like to welcome everybody, and thank you all very much for joining us today. My name is George Quinlan. As you can see, I work for Protiviti here in Chicago. I'm part of our security program and strategy practice, and within there, we have a specialized team that specializes in cyber risk quantification. Specifically, we do a lot of work with Open FAIR and the FAIR Institute. I am a member of the FAIR Institute. I'm also a member of ISACA here in Chicago. I'm on the board of directors, and I've been actually teaching for ISACA for about, probably 10, 15 years now. I teach the CISA and C-Risk certification review courses. There's a link to my contact information, and looking forward to share with you some really interesting information that's come out from NIST. And with that, enough about me. I'll turn it back over to you, Rebecca, and we'll get started today.
Sounds good. So I'm not sure if everyone has had the opportunity or the chance to read the 75-page NIST Ir 8286 document that was issued in October 2020. So no worries. George and I are going to walk you through some of the highlights, give you some insight into the overall concerns that initiated the entire publication. We're going to also go over some of the proposed solutions and specifically highlight some of the suggested frameworks and methodologies, and go into a little bit more detail and context with those. And throughout our presentation, we'll also give you examples of lessons learned, best practices, and hopefully some practical advice that you can take back to your institution. So what is NIST Ir 8286? Honestly, I'm really not surprised that this publication came out when it did. Nor am I surprised by the subject matter. It was issued October 2020, and it had to do with cybersecurity risk, and I'm going to keep messing that up for some reason. I don't know why I can't get it in my head, and enterprise risk management. But if we think back, and the reason I'm not surprised is because if we think back to our businesses 5, 10 years ago, and we think of the increased speed of change, the growing market volatility, how complex our businesses have become, the high expectations that we're seeing from our investors, and the pressures from our regulators, and also from an IT standpoint, the increase in the new technologies over the last few years. We have wireless connections, we have cloud computing, we have the Internet of Things, as well as the assets that the data is stored on, transmitted, and used. We all, I think, have seen policies within our organizations of bring your device to work. People are using mobile devices, wireless. It's just made our environment so much more complex. And then you layer in 2020, COVID, where we had to make a very fast transition to work from home in a majority of the organizations, I would say. And then from a healthcare perspective, you're also looking at telehealth and the cyber risks that also entails, as well as everyone being stuck at home and either needing to or preferring not to go outside and doing a lot of their shopping and a lot of things online. I think that this has just opened the Pandora's box to cybersecurity risk. And from my perspective and my experience in ERM, this publication really resonated with me, all 75 pages of it. And I really could relate to the concerns and the frustrations that it was addressing from a cybersecurity risk perspective. This NIST publication really addresses the challenges of evaluating, translating, and communicating all those risks that I just mentioned to senior leadership and to the board, and making sure that's communicated in a meaningful way and in a manner that resonates with them so that they know what they can deploy or invest in the areas that would assist the organizations in being successful while still managing that and managing those risks. The publication also addresses the issues of looking at cybersecurity not in a silo, but looking at it across all levels of the organization and all the different buckets. And the publication also gives guidance on the methodologies to assess risks, such as open FAIR and utilizing ERM methodologies. So this slide really can be used for any risk continuum and any department or business. We call it enterprise because it really can address all of them. If you look at that first bucket, really the starting point of the risk is like knowing the risks out there and identifying and communicating them. Then you kind of move to that next bucket where it's a checklist approach. Put together a checklist. It identifies the risks and the controls associated with mitigating them, but it's more of a check the box type of thing. Yep, it's managed, it's identified. But really, how do you move from the first two buckets of identifying those risks and controls to really answering those questions that you see along the bottom from the board, from the C-suite, and from the enterprise risk management? This NIST IR publication really points out that there's a disconnect between what senior leaders and the board are asking from the beginning of that continuum. And really some of the questions are those risks truly being mitigated to the level that senior leadership is comfortable with? There's a risk list, but how impactful are those risks to our organization? Just knowing them and checking them off doesn't tell us the impact. And I'm not just talking about like a high, medium, and low. Those are very subjective, but really what are the actual dollars and cents associated with those risks? And we also, thanks for IT for conducting those pen tests and vulnerability tests, but really what does it mean? How do we correlate those risks identified through those tests to our business objectives? And the NIST framework or the NIST publication is really just pointing out all those challenges. So that really leads us to this next slide and addressing the cybersecurity risk across a bunch of different areas. and really looking at it from a holistic perspective and linking it to those business objectives. As you see, cybersecurity is listed in each one of those boxes, and aggregating that impact and it being able to effectively communicate that to the organization. These 4 areas really come from the COSO framework model, but this type of information really starts to help bridge that gap between doing a cybersecurity review through your IT department and linking it to the business objectives of your organization. This information will help senior leadership prioritize where to invest their pool of money. And if I think about this from a personal context, it's much easier to convince someone to spend like $20,000 doing a kitchen upgrade, making everything real pretty, but it's much harder to convince someone to spend $20,000 to fix their leaky roof. I mean, we've had to do it. So that you don't get any benefit. There isn't that shiny new thing that you can see all the time. So both add value, but which one should be prioritized? And how do you effectively communicate that and evaluate that so you make sure that those who are making the decisions are making the right ones for the organization? So this is just an illustrative example of, I think, what Nist Ir is trying to get at through their publication, and really linking the missions, strategies, and goals to the risks. This is something this is healthcare. This is something I've done for a healthcare organization in the past. And it's very high level, but you see the various operating goals across the top and the strategic plan for the healthcare organization. And below it, you see the risk areas that really directly correlate to those operating goals and strategies, and what risks we're identifying that could derail the organization from meeting their mission and objectives. You can also see that cybersecurity and IT are definitely ones that have been prioritized, but this is definitely high level, and there's more underlying detail to the evaluation of these risks, but this is more of an illustration to show those macro trends and how they roll up and correlate to those missions, strategies, goals, so that you can effectively communicate that linkage to senior leadership. Okay, ERM. So part of this publication, NISTIR mentions utilizing enterprise risk management programs to communicate cybersecurity risk. But really, what is ERM? Sometimes I think that people are very scared of this term, or they think it's just the check the box, or they're very intimidated by it. But in reality, it doesn't have to be overcomplicated. It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all, and it can still, even though it's not overly complicated, it can still provide meaningful, valuable information to executives. And if we think about that last slide, we see that all organizations, and I would think that you would encounter this in your daily life too, but all organizations have some sort of goal or objectives that they want to achieve, right? Enterprise risks, that category, that term, are these uncertainty or the risks that give uncertainty to achieving those objectives. And all an ERM program is intended to do is to identify, evaluate, and report on those risks in order to arm senior leadership with the information that's needed to ensure the strategy is met, or that non-achievement of those strategies and goals. So you want to make $1 million. If we're not going to make that, how can we change, or how can we implement changes or mitigation plans to make sure that we achieve those strategies? Or do we need to have an overall business plan pivot? And I think a lot of organizations this might resonate with, because I think during COVID, a lot of people had to look really deeply at their strategies and probably pivot their entire business plan because of the pandemic. But the sooner that you can identify those risks are coming down and evaluate those and see the impact, the quicker you're able to pivot successfully. In NIST IR, this 8286 publication really focuses on how cybersecurity should be one of those relevant inputs or those relevant enterprise risks when we're looking at the ERM framework. So I have a question for everyone. Sorry. Does your organization have an enterprise risk management program? Yes, we have a robust ERM program. Yes, but the ERM program seems to be a checkbox of tasks. Nope, but we're going to be developing one, or I don't even know what ERM really is. I'll give you guys a couple minutes to answer that. But I've seen the gamut of enterprise risk management programs. Financial services tends to have more robust ERM programs because it's a regulation. It's something that's required for them to do. They also are highly regulated, and they have a lot of underlying, very stable foundational controls and policies and procedures, and overall governance structure. Whereas in healthcare, although what I've seen and experienced is, although that was highly regulated, enterprise risk management is not something that is required for them to do. So their enterprise risk management programs are kind of lower on the maturity scale. They're a little bit harder to implement because it's not something that has to be done. I don't think anything is necessarily right or wrong, and every organization's journey is a little bit different. Luke, where are we from a response standpoint? Have a lot of people responded?
I'm checking right now in the preview.
And George, do you have any experience or any other input from what you've seen?
No, I think it's a great question. My experience is that a lot of organizations don't really understand what ERM is. We're so focused on cyber and technical risks that we aren't seeing the broader picture. So I think this is really helpful and on point. Thank you.
Oh, so we're developing a program. That's so interesting. I do like that there are 23% of you, or 24, that do have a robust ERM program. That's good. And I do like the 7% that says, huh, because I do think that's like, what is ERM really? But we are seeing at Protiviti, there are a lot, I think it mostly has to do because of COVID and the pandemic. Everyone seems to have, or I shouldn't say everyone, we're seeing a lot of requests for organizations that want to reimagine ERM or take it back to the drawing board or start developing an ERM program just so that they can be more timely in the responses to risk and make sure that senior leadership and the board know what potential risks are out there. And that's really what ERM is intended to do. So for those of you that are developing an ERM program or don't know what ERM is, here's a really good starting point. These are resources, and there's many of them, such as the COSO framework, which is the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, OMB circulars, Office of Management and Budget, ISO 31000, ISAC IT risk framework. These are frameworks and guidance to help you process and implement an ERM program. Genuinely, they're much similar. They have similar approaches. They really identify context, risk. They analyze the risk. They estimate its importance. They determine how to respond to it, to execute that response, and they also identify and respond to changes over time. That's what these approaches really include. Whichever framework you really prescribe to, or which one of these that you use, I think the underlying factor is to know and to note the intent of ERM overall. So NIST IR, the publication, specifically mentions how OMB defines enterprise risk management. I'm going to read you the definition. It's an effective agency-wide approach to addressing the full spectrum of the organization's significant risk by understanding the combined impact of risk as an interrelated portfolio rather than addressing risks only in silos. And I think the NIST IR 8286 really is trying to hammer this home, that they think that one of the big downfalls to cybersecurity risk assessment is that it's in a silo, it doesn't look across the entire organization, and how we're communicating that and really using the ERM framework to help facilitate those challenges. And one example that NIST IR does utilize is that cybersecurity risk and credit risk are different elements within the ERM portfolio. And it's quite possible that if you have a cybersecurity breach, it could result in a credit downgrade or a loss of public confidence. And these interdependencies make it important for ERM managers across the different areas to really collaborate, communicate, and really recognize that the information that they have and the information, the technology and business risks are not isolated issues. They really go across the entire organization. So we heard about the intent of ERM and some of the frameworks and methodologies that we can utilize. However, we also do recognize and acknowledge that sometimes the intent of ERM doesn't align with the executed approach. NIST, the NIST publication even acknowledges that enterprises are at various degrees, like we saw in the polling question, and I've seen through experience, we're at different degrees or varying degrees of maturity regarding the implementation of risk management. And this slide really kind of just identifies some of those ERM challenges that we're seeing and hearing about, and those that are similar to those that are mentioned in the publication. NIST, the NIST IR 8286 is putting really some of those issues and challenges of ERM onto the cybersecurity folks, but really your organization's ERM committee should be addressing those disconnects as well. So we've talked a lot about frameworks, the COSO framework, but how do you really go about implementing it, and what does the ERM framework and approach look like? This is an example of an approach that we've developed, but that can be tailored to your organization's needs, goals, and actually like your leadership's appetite for ERM. Like we said, ERM programs are really intended to help organizations anticipate, adapt, and respond to the changes, and focusing efforts and resources on risks and opportunities that can impact their strategic performance. So if you look at those external factors across the top, you'll see that we want to focus on risks and opportunities, but the other ones should look fairly familiar to you, because I think these components are pretty similar across a lot of other risk assessment frameworks, looking at the reporting and evaluation and monitoring of risks across a continuum. But this approach and framework also layers in some of the other things that NIST has identified as challenges. And from a strategic perspective, it considers the impact of the risks on the strategy and performance across the entire organization, and also integrate, and this is probably a little bit further along on the ERM journey for some, but integrating those risks when you're doing strategy setting, planning, and business execution. But what I really want to focus on too are those ERM pillars. We see risk appetite. That's a pillar that is the foundation for all of the other risks and evaluation. Is what types and amount of risk is your organization willing to accept in pursuit of your mission and goals. These are usually defined by senior leadership. And then risk culture. What's that top down? Who's sponsoring ERM? What is their appetite for implementing an enterprise risk management program? And the last, but I think one of the most important, is the first step, and that's establishing a governance structure that really defines the roles, responsibilities, and communication patterns from an ERM program perspective. So this next slide is just an example or illustration that you can maybe utilize as a starting point for putting together an ERM structure, governance structure. As you'll see, we have the business units as the bottom, the enterprise risk committee, and then that reporting structure up to executive leadership and the board. The middle, when you're looking at the taxonomy, ERM taxonomy, that's really making sure that there's that standardized language about risk, standardized ways to evaluate the risk, and then also that communication of risks across the organization. So this is just an example. Hopefully it's a starting point for conversation in a way that you can start pulling together an enterprise risk program. And then ERM is a journey. Like I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all, it's a journey. And this kind of portrays ERM on a maturity scale and the value it can add to your organization. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. It can be anywhere on this continuum. And this is another starting point of discussion with your senior leadership. Where does your organization want to be from an ERM perspective? Do they just want to prioritize and evaluate the enterprise risks? Or do they want to start using those risks when they are doing their strategy setting? And this is just an example of where you can be within the continuum and what it entails. So with that, I will turn it over to George to go into some more depth on this.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm going to take over a little bit from here, and we're going to start with, why was this developed and what concerns does it address? And the two main concerns is bridging the gap from cybersecurity to ERM up to executives and really communicating risk in business terms. It turns out, as a profession, NIST is seeing this, and we see it too, that we don't really speak the language very well of the business. We don't connect to the C-suite and executives. And so as we look kind of at the left, there's cybersecurity. We're very technical. We're tactical. Maybe we're controls oriented, but we do things like pen testing and vulnerability assessments and very technical stuff. And when you go talk to an executive, they don't really understand what we're talking about. It doesn't translate into business speak. And as a result, we're not communicating in terms that they understand. As we sort of move up to ERM, we're often becoming more strategic. We're using frameworks like COSO. We see a lot of either semi-quantitative or qualitative types of risk analyses. Risk is probability or likelihood times impact, which is semi-quantitative, or, the one I cringe a little bit, low, medium, high, right? Very subjective. But as we get up into executive levels, they're not technical, they're strategic, and they're focused on their core business mission. And as we go even up a little bit higher to the board, they're responsible for ERM risk, strategic. They understand dollars, not tech. They understand that they're trying to run a business and that risks, be they cyber risks or ERM risks, may impact them, but they really don't understand how. The conversation goes something like, tell me what I need to know, right? Tell me, what really is at risk here. These are some of the problems that I've not only personally seen in my professional practice, but NIST IR. By the way, IR stands for internal report. I had to look it up. It's not incident response, like if anybody's in security or tech might think on the call. It addresses these issues, points them out, and then gives us a couple different ways to solve that problem. The answer, the problem as we lay this out is that we don't communicate to ERM and the business very well. And I'm sure we've all been in this position. Have you ever felt like somebody doesn't understand what you're trying to tell them? Have you ever been frustrated? You're trying to communicate this to executive leadership or somebody in the business, and they really don't understand what you're talking about. It's such a pervasive problem that it led to the development and release of this report. And what NISTIR says is that enterprises don't communicate risk guidance in consistent, repeatable ways. Think about all the different security assessments and the things that we do. We do pen tests, we do vulnerability scans, we do audits, we do security assessments, we do risk assessments. They tend to all be one-off engagements. They're not very repeatable. And then we hand them over to someone on Rebecca's team and say, hey, take all this data and aggregate it and communicate it up to the board, right? And that's a difficult task given that they're all different, very technical information. And it's not documented and tracked in such a way that it can be translated or aggregated. And worse, a lot of organizations don't create risk registers. So one of the things NISTIR recommends is that you create and manage your risk program within some sort of risk register. Finally, the third point is that when we do see people doing risk quantification, they're largely done in some sort of ad hoc manner. Somebody, takes a single point estimate and says, I think it's $1 million risk or things like that. It's not performed with any sort of rigor or analysis as we might see in other areas of the enterprise. So what they go on to say is that if we could come up with some sort of better risk measurement and risk analysis method, it would not only boost the quality of the information, it would actually link back to the ERM and to the business, and would actually result in better management of cybersecurity at the enterprise level and continue to support the enterprise's objectives. It's moving us up that risk maturity continuum that Rebecca touched on. We see this a lot. Being compliant doesn't mean you are secured. A lot of risk assessment or just cyber risk I'm referring to, and in some cases ERM risk too, start with a semi-quantitative controls questionnaire. We check the box. Maybe we're doing a NIST CFS assessment. Maybe it's ISO. Maybe it's something else. You've all seen these. These are the 200 questionnaires. They're sent out in Excel. And the problem is this fails to communicate and quantify the risk in the information in terms that the business can, one, understand, but two, it's not usable. What do you do with this information? Once I have, I'm a NIST 1.3, on a 5-point maturity scale, I struggle a little bit too professionally. What does it mean? And what does it mean if I go to a 1.5? What does that really mean to me in terms of dollars and cents? And that's where a lot of organizations are sort of getting stuck, and that was really never our intent. So there's really sort of three ways of quantifying or looking at risk. And traditionally, there's a qualitative risk assessment. There's a semi-quantitative risk assessment, and there's a quantitative, or in our case, a FAIR risk assessment. And one of the things I want to point out is, the first two are somewhat subjective, and the third one is much more quantifiable. The orientation of the first two is controls-based, and when you're doing a FAIR risk assessment, it's based on business risk. It's a very different perspective on things. And one of the two of the single biggest factors I see is the first two don't really consider the threats, the assets, or the outcomes. They just tend to look at the controls, which is sort of looking at this in a vacuum. The big thing, too, is they don't look at the timing of this. So, we're not looking at risk. In FAIR, we would call this an annualized loss. We look at everything annualized, so we're looking at it on the same page. One of the things in FAIR we talk about is anything is possible given enough time, but what's really probable to occur? What is the real risk, right? There certainly is a risk that we could have a pandemic, but it's, likely a once 100-year event type thing, right? And traditional risk assessments don't look at that. So we're missing a big piece of the picture, if you will. We traditionally apply controls based on best practices and intuition, and we hope implicitly that they're going to reduce risk. And it's very hard to measure. It's expensive. We go in and ask for lots of money and things like that. The way to do this in a quantitative manner is to look at threats, map them to the assets, and then look at controls that explicitly target threat and asset combinations and can reduce them. And not only then are we looking at the right risks, we're quantifying and reducing risks both before and afterwards, so we can actually measure these things and do some neat things, which we'll talk on a second about aggregating risk and adding them up and doing some of the different things that you can do when you're quantifying risk. So that's kind of the problem that they set out to solve. And, how do we solve all these things? And that's really the point of all of this, is not laying out the problem, but really what is the solution? What is the better way? And so we're going to touch on a couple things. One is your required data and models. We'll talk about recommended risk quantification methods as recommended by NISTIR. We'll talk about how FAIR and cyber risk quantification fits within the NISTIR 8286 framework and recommendation. And I'll give you guys actually a couple examples of annualized risks that we've done to show you how all this fits together. So just a quick question as we go along. It helps me a little bit. I thought it would be helpful to ask you all, do you guys do cyber risk quantification? Do you have any of these capabilities today in your organization, be it FAIR or some other type of methodology? Just a yes, no, not sure. I've never heard of cyber risk quantification. Curious to see who's in the audience here. I'll give you guys just a second to answer. But my own experience is that, everybody's doing qualitative, semi-quantitative for the most part. And when I learned about FAIR, it was really an eye-opener. For me, it was sort of next generation risk to be able to actually quantify and put dollars to these. And it was something I was seeing that was missing. I personally saw this gap in my own professional practice, and I was really excited to, learn that there actually is a good way to solve these problems and connect the dots, if you will. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and we'll see. So this is great. About half of us are doing FAIR or cyber risk quantification of some manner. About 40% of us aren't. 12% not sure. That's fair. And nobody's never heard of it. So that's a good sign, at least, right? One thing I don't want to lose sight of, and this is really fundamental. Risk management is all about making decisions fundamentally. And so if we start from what we call the bottom of the stack, you first have to have some kind of model or definition. It allows us to model and define risks and do it in a consistent and repeatable manner. FAIR is that model, and in my world at least, we look at the likelihood on the left side and we look at the impact. We quantify 6 forms of loss, primary and secondary, on different measures. We're able to then measure those particular factors, and we can also measure the risk based on the controls that are in place, not on some sort of arbitrary targets. Doing so gives us the ability to make comparisons. We can look at controls. We can look at inherent risks versus residual risks. We can look at costs of projects and how they mitigate things, which enables us ultimately to make some sort of informed decision. Business decisions can be made based on what the real impact is to the organization. Instead of having some sort of audit finding that says it's high risk, we can actually present actionable business intelligence that the business can do something about when we get into risk treatment. And we can do so based upon better real-world data, which is, in my mind, it's sort of this holy grail of where we needed to be all along, from moving from that continuum Rebecca showed early on, risk, up to what we call cyber risk economics. That's the whole point of this, is to make good decisions. This is the NISTIR version of the same slide. I don't love their slides, but it is a NISTIR presentation, so I wanted to share with you guys how NISTIR presented this. We spent a lot of time internally trying to translate NISTIR talk into something that was actually a little bit more digestible. But what they're trying to get at here is improving the measurements can improve the quality of the information. And they've got this same sort of cycle that everybody runs through: identifying the context, identifying the risk, assessing it, prioritizing risks, executing risk response, and monitor, evaluating, and adjusting reporting on this. The point is, how we communicate these things matters. And improving these communications can help us understand the challenge, help executives understand sort of the world that the cybersecurity people live in. And yet at the same time, we're presenting it in the language that they're used to receiving, which is dollars and cents, right? They're used to seeing income statements, balance sheets, financial statements, and things like that. And if we're speaking in their language and connecting the underlying risk to the business risk, it's going to resonate a whole lot better than the way we traditionally do it today. NISTIR, just to be clear, says do cyber risk quantification. They recommend there's 3 possible techniques for doing so. The one I think everybody's most familiar with is Monte Carlo. The example is open FAIR. There's another possible way within ISO 31000 called event tree analysis. And there's a third model called Bayesian analysis. I couldn't find an example. I don't have an example for you guys on that one. I'm a FAIR guy, so I like Monte Carlo simulation. I've not actually seen anyone implement Bayesian in the real world. But FAIR, just to be clear, does say do cyber risk quantification. And there's 3 possible approaches for doing so. We tend to prefer FAIR because it's got a lot of open source methodology and content that basically gives you the cookbook on how to go run a risk analysis. Within NISTIR itself, it doesn't actually tell you how to do these analyses. I think somebody asked a question about that. How do you do one of these, right? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is NISTIR doesn't tell you how to do that, but FAIR does. And so if you're not sure, download the FAIR risk taxonomy, the FAIR risk assessment methodology. ISACA has some very good guidance out there that's been recently published on how to do risk assessment and apply these things. And NISTIR 8286 is out. In the document, it promises that they are going to be releasing soon, they don't specify when, a supplemental document called NISTIR 8286A. And within that document, they are supposedly going to give us more concrete guidance on how to run a risk analysis and also actual examples of risks themselves that are risk constructs, or what we would actually call loss event scenarios within FAIR, of how to run some of these things. Point here being there are a couple different options available. I don't want to make the whole presentation just about FAIR. So there's a couple different options. And so the point here, and NISTIR goes on to say this too, these methods are not mutually exclusive, right? They say you can start triaging risk. You can start doing the current things that you're doing now. And I'm going to give you guys an example of what this looks like in the real world. I've never seen a client in the real world go out and overnight just say, we're turning the switch and we're going from qualitative or semi-quantitative over to FAIR overnight. It just doesn't work that way. So we'll typically see a current risk management program. They have a controls environment. My organization does a lot of NIST CSF gaps analyses and things like this, where we go in and we say, here's the top gaps, here's the top findings, here's your maturity. We identify gaps, and we tend to take those and roll them into top cyber threat scenarios and do cyber risk quantification on those. And NISTIR is saying the same thing. They're saying start by triaging, and it's certainly valid to go do qualitative or semi-quantitative risk analyses, and then figure out kind of what your big items are out of there and identify and quantify those as your high priority categories. And NIST, of course, breaks them down into these categories like risk management, risk assessment, supply chain, identity and access management and such, right? This all aligns with NIST. If we look at some of the frameworks that are out there, this is the NIST RMF, NIST SP 830 Risk Management Framework. FAIR itself fits within the overall risk management framework. So it's really kind of the same process. We're preparing, we're conducting a risk assessment, identifying threat sources and events, identifying vulnerabilities and conditions, determining the likelihood, the magnitude, the risks, communicating them, and then monitoring and treating them, right? FAIR specifically fits in with these yellow boxes. FAIR is complementary. It's not competing in any way. It's a risk analysis framework that nicely plugs in and fits within a lot of these other frameworks like we're talking about, specifically in the context of this presentation within 8286 and NIST RMF. So this isn't something that's mutually exclusive. It's very complementary. FAIR is really just the analysis piece of this, and it gives us a really nice way of doing reporting on the back end in a way that aggregates nicely up to the board. I mentioned it's complementary. It plugs into all of these other frameworks. And we're starting to see a lot of guidance come out where NIST is recommending FAIR as complementary. We just saw guidance come out that COSO is recommending FAIR is a risk quantification methodology as well. So is the recently updated and released ISACA Risk Management Framework 2.0. And I've even heard recently that PCI is starting to recommend FAIR as a risk analysis and quantification methodology for doing credit card or PCI risk. The point is we can identify top risks, quantify risks, look at the efficacy of treatment options, and communicate it to a language that everyone understands all the way up to the board. When you start to do these, we start to see a number of things come out of the FAIR model. One is we've established a common risk register. And we're establishing a common language around risks, creating visibility, and we can then look at the management of these. We can look for these and assess them to quantify these risks. We can do comparisons to look at, is risk A larger than risk B? Are we treating them in the right way? And this has always been a really nebulous one. When you ask somebody to look at risk appetite and risk tolerance levels, when you're walking in and saying, it's a high, medium, and low risk, are you good with that? They tend to look back at you and say, I don't really know. You haven't given me the basis to make that decision. I'll show you guys an example in a couple slides of a risk register where we quantified risk and we started to put in very hard dollars around risk tolerances and risk appetite based upon what would be a material finding and actually end up in their SEC reports to Wall Street. One of the things I kind of want to mention to you guys, and I think this is really important, we often talk about risk quantification and we talk about risks in a lot of different manners, but one of the things where we see sort of people go wrong when they scope risks is just how they're scoped, right? In all of these things, and this actually comes from ISACA, and it came back from 2013 from COVID 5. But ISACA is saying the same thing. We're all kind of saying the same thing, but people in the industry tend to just use these control questionnaires. When you scope a risk, it should contain an actor, and this could be internal or external. It should contain some type of threat type. It could be malicious, accidental, errors, failures. It could be a natural disaster. There is some type of event that occurs. We would think of these as disclosure, interruption, modification. Something happened that made an event. Somebody broke in. And it's always affecting an asset. And one of the other things we see a lot with FAIR, and we don't see this traditionally, is assets are people, their skills, their organization structures. More importantly, their business processes. They're the underlying data. They are the applications. And very, very last, and I almost deleted this off of the slide, the infrastructure. Infrastructure being, the servers, the PCs, the phones. And here's the problem. This is usually what we go assess against. And the business, honestly, I said very rarely, but really they don't care about your server. They care about the data that's on it, and they actually care about the business process that it supports. So tell me if that server goes down, what's really going to be impacted? Sales? Okay, now you have my attention. And this last piece is time. And there's some various things to think about. Duration, how long would the event occur? When's the occurrence? If it's the middle of the month-end close and I got to get numbers out and it took down the accounting department, that's really critical. Other times of the year, it might not be as critical. If it's a retailer and it's Christmas shopping season, very, very critical, but maybe come February, not as critical, right? Also, things to consider are how quickly can we detect things, time lag to detection, and annualization or annualizing these, which we do within FAIR, puts everything in the same terms so we can easily compare risks to one another. And that's really critical. If it's a $10 million risk per year, that's a very big difference than if it's a $10 million risk once over 100 years. So that's implicit in the methodology itself. But traditionally, we don't consider these things. Here's an example of top annualized risks. So I wanted to give you guys an exactual practical example of a real risk register that we did using FAIR. And we have different scenarios that we've built, and there's always an asset, a threat, and an outcome. So in this case, these are well-scoped risk scenarios. And we looked in this case, I'll just look at the first one. What is the risk associated with users causing a loss of confidentiality of our trade secrets via stealing data? Somebody was concerned that somebody inside the organization may steal trade secrets, right? And we quantified that risk to an average loss annually of $20.4 million. At the 90th percentile is $18.7 million. And there's a maximum potential, way on the tail end of the curve, if you will, of $612 million. It's an extreme event, very unlikely, but it's possible. This is a much more elevated, sophisticated conversation to have with a business person than talking about a high type risk, right? Typically, we break down risk two ways. One is, what single event could cost us the most? What's going to put us on the front page of the Wall Street Journal? And which are the events that are likely to cause us the most on an annualized basis? So it's two ways to look at this thing. In this case, the organization set their risk tolerance at $3 million, or their risk appetite. And we were able to look at the probability of events exceeding those. Here's an example of a risk register. And this was an organization that had a qualitative risk methodology. And you can actually see we characterized qualitative risks as low, medium, and high. What we did that was a little bit different is across the top, we broke them down by threat method, and down the Y column, the asset. And then what we started to do, and NISTIR recommends that you do have a risk register like this, right? But what we started to do then was look at top risks and quantify those that stood out, that were things that the organization really cared about. And I want to call your attention to this little blurb in the lower right-hand corner that got added, which is all about risk appetite. And it was material for financial reporting for this organization is $5 million, as risks with an average ALE, annualized loss expectancy, of $5 million are considered at least moderate. These are the things that they would have to report actually to their financial auditors. And so these are the things that they sort of cared about at the most, and they naturally sort of set their risk appetite. And it was much harder to do this consistently in the past when everything was low, medium, and high. They had no idea. And as you look at this too, some things stand out. Even though these are medium, for instance, a $19 million medium risk is probably not the same as a $3 million risk, and a $67 million high risk is, almost twice as high as a, $28 million risk. So not all high risks are the same, if you will. Much better to put this in terms of dollars and cents. All of this ultimately helps us answer business questions. And there are sort of about 6 business questions that we can ask with risk quantification. And, these are the 6 most common examples that we see. One is just how much risk do we have? And there's an example of a curve. Because FAIR in risk quantification is based on real math, which is versus what we call fake math being the low, mediums, or highs, or the probability and impacts. We are able to actually aggregate them and add them up. We're able to answer questions like, what are our top risks? We're able to actually trend risk over time and look, is it changed? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? We're able to model risk in the lower left. This is a before and after. You can see a yellow and a blue curve overlaying one another. We've modeled before and after risk, given us a certain type of scenario. In the bottom, we can talk about what types of risk, or what type of losses we can expect. Productivity, response cost, replacement costs. These are all the costs that we would quantify within the FAIR model. Primary costs. The secondary costs are things like reputation and a lost business value, fines and judgments, and things like that might come around, which are the big events. And we can also look at cost benefits of projects. We did this with a particular organization and showed that they had something like $80 million in risk, and the board went, whoa, wait a minute. And actually it was kind of a neat story, because the board came back to the CISO and handed them an additional $10 million in funding to go mitigate these big risks that were identified. So kind of a neat outcome, right? Versus, the security department, having to beg the business for money. The business was going to the security department, saying, please fix these things. So we're getting up towards the end of time here. So I want to talk about next steps and have some questions, and open up the floor for a couple questions if we have some time, and ask you guys a quick question. One is, if you'd be interested in learning more about ERM or CRQ, please respond. We're certainly happy to answer follow-up questions. And if you guys are interested, let us know if it's something you'd be interested in. Somebody will follow up with you after the webinar. I will also provide you guys a little bit. I'm going to skip past that slide real quick, and point out that there are some additional resources available. Rebecca and myself, please connect with us on LinkedIn. Here are our email addresses. If you'd like some additional information, we have a page on the Protiviti website dedicated to both FAIR and ERM. I've had a hard time looking at the Q&A question, so Rebecca, maybe we can open it up. If you had a chance to see if any questions came in that we might be able to answer here in the remaining 3-4 minutes we have available to us.
Yes, and you might have answered some of this, but how do you take the thousands of risks identified doing assessments with scenarios, considering threats, threat sources, and vulnerabilities calculated using likelihood and impact to FAIR-based model? And I think you touched on this a little bit, but if you want to expand on it. So taking it from likelihood to impact to the FAIR-based model.
There really are two types of risk assessments. One's a bottom-up and one's a top-down. And FAIR is really a top-down driven methodology. If you have thousands of risks, that's a good thing. But one of the things we do within the FAIR methodology is we look for what's probable, not what's possible. So we would tend to come in and look at an existing risk register and look at really the top risks. We don't need to go quantify every single risk that's in your risk register, especially if they're low risk. And start at the top down of the risk register, if you will, based upon prioritization and quantify the things that matter the most. So the example that I showed was a good example of doing that. No one tends to go in and quantify thousands of risks in every single thing within an organization. It's just typically not necessary. There aren't usually that many risks. The other thing is we can add them up, right? Because it's real math, I can take 4 different risks that are at a division or a lower level in the organization. I can add them up to the divisional or the operating company and then add them up to the ERM and the overall board level risk, right? You can't do that with semi-quantitative and qualitative types of risk management methodologies. So there's a little bit of that we get into when you get into how you would do a FAIR risk analysis that I just unfortunately don't have the time to address on how to do a FAIR analysis today on this call. But I would encourage you, and I'm more than happy to take this question offline and walk through how we apply FAIR to a risk register and list of risks really in the real world.
Sounds good. And here's another question. What size organizations have you implemented CRQ in? Are they big?
We've seen organizations of all sizes do this. It's important that you get started. It's never going to, perfect is the enemy of the good, right? Typically, we can capture, what the top risks are in an organization and get people running and off to the races. And you don't have to be a Fortune 100 level enterprise to go do something like this. This methodology is something that I've seen, organizations as small as a couple hundred people apply all the way up to the largest Fortune organizations really in the world.
Great.
I have one more question that came in for you, Rebecca, I think that you should ask, which is, what are some of the hurdles in starting or implementing an ERM program?
Yeah, you know what? I think some of the biggest hurdles that I've seen is really getting that sponsorship and buy-in from senior leadership to even take the journey, especially when you look at organizations where this is not a required task, right? How do you show the value that ERM can bring to the organization? And also not starting off with too much to chew, right? Like it can be overwhelming when you look at an ERM framework and the COSO framework. How do you start with a simple task and make sure it's known as a journey, so that it's flexible and you can kind of move along the continuum. You don't have to start at the top with, shooting for the top. You can take it in chunks, make it simple so that you do start to get that buy-in and sponsorship from the organization. And I know we have a minute left, so I'm going to kind of leave it at there so we don't run over time. And we have a minute to thank Luke and the FAIR Institute for letting us present to you today.
Luke, I want to thank you, and Rebecca, thank you, and I want to especially thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you found it helpful. And Luke, we'll turn it back over to you for closing comments and wrap up, please.
Yeah, thank you both so much. That was an awesome presentation, really insightful, and really great to listen to. Thank you so much for doing this for us. Everybody, there will be continued discussion on FAIR Institute link. The member resource community for FAIR Institute members. We are going to post this up there later today, maybe tomorrow morning, and the discussion can continue on FAIR Institute link, and we will be answering questions or any threads that pop up there. So with that, I would like to wish everybody a great rest of your day, and we will all talk soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye now.